Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Taylor's secret nut disclosure detonates like an emotional earthquake that rips through every precisely constructed taradiddle she has lived by, leaving Ridge hugely blindsided, lowered, and emotionally disassembled as the woman he trusted, defended, and believed to be the moral compass of his fractured romantic world is suddenly exposed as someone able of deception so deep it reshapes the history, venoms the present, and annihilates the future. Because this isn't simply an affair but a strictly hidden double life that Taylor maintained with nipping perfection, smiling into Ridge's eyes while harboring stolen moments, rumored pledges, and covert passion with another man whose identity sends shockwaves through the entire oil, transubstantiating Taylor from the wounded, righteous figure she portrayed into the mastermind of Ridge's ultimate treason, and as the verity emerges piece by piece, through accidental eavesdropped exchanges, lost phone dispatches, shamefaced silences, and the unmistakable look of fear that flashes across Taylor's face when the walls eventually near in, Ridge's desolation becomes sorrowfully necessary, because this treason doesn't just break his heart, it shatters his sense of reality, forcing him to question every memory, every conciliation, every moment of closeness they participated, wondering now whether any of it was ever real or simply part of Taylor's precisely curated vision, and the cruel irony is that Ridge had spent so long believing Taylor was the safe harbor from chaos, the woman who represented stability after times of emotional warfare, only to discover that she was still living a resemblant actuality fueled by desire, secretiveness, and emotional performance, a retired love that gave her everything she claimed she was no longer seeking, leaving Ridge to grapple with the horrifying consummation that while he was choosing her again and again, she was formerly choosing someone differently. And the exposure of this double life becomes lower about the affair itself and further about the ruinous cerebral fallout, as Ridge spirals into wrathfulness, grief, unbelief, and tone imputation, replaying every argument he defended her in, every blameworthiness he dismissed as paranoia, every red flag he ignored in the name of love, now fating that his fidelity was weaponized against him, while Taylor's apologies deteriorate under the weight of her own insincerity as she struggles to explain how loneliness turned into craving, how emotional vulnerability evolved into physical treason, and how she induced herself that she could categorize love without consequence, only to discover too late that secrets always demand payment, and the fallout spreads outward, polluting every relationship in its path as musketeers take sides, families fracture, and long-buried resentments resurface with renewed ferocity, because Taylor's treason doesn't live in insulation, it reopens old injuries, validates one's fears, and forces everyone to defy uncomfortable trueness about trust, remission, and the recreating cycles of heartache that define their lives, while Ridge's pain becomes the emotional center of the storm, raw and undressed as he switches out not just at Taylor but at himself for believing in redemption that was no way truly earned, for mistaking familiarity for safety, and for allowing stopgap to stamp instinct, and as the secret nuts part becomes clearer, whether he was a calculated escape or an unanticipated emotional lifeline, the narrative grows indeed darker, revealing that Taylor wasn't simply a victim of circumstance but an active party in her own death, someone who sought confirmation and secretiveness rather than honesty, and when brazened, her gashes and guilt ring concave against the magnitude of the damage done, because justifications cannot unlive the falsehoods or abolish the fact that Ridge's heart was contributory damage in a love story he was no way meant to know was, and in the fate, as Ridge stands amid the remains of what he believed was an alternate chance at happiness, he's forced to review himself outside the shadow of treason, questioning whether love is worth the pain it inescapably brings or whether walking down is the only form of tone respect left to him, while Taylor faces her own reckoning, stripped of moral high ground, forced to defy the verity that in trying to avoid being alone, she assured the veritably insulation she stressed, and the story does end with exposure but with metamorphosis, as treason becomes the catalyst for unrecoverable change, altering alliances, reshaping fates, and reminding everyone that in a world erected on passion and secrets, the most dangerous falsehoods are the bones told in the name of love, because when Taylor's retired love eventually comes to light, it doesn't just destroy Ridge, it destroys the vision that some hearts are unable of breaking others, leaving behind a heritage of heartache, shattered trust, and the haunting question of whether true love can ever survive the weight of such a ruinous double life. In the wake of the exposure, silence becomes the loudest presence of all, a suffocating stillness that hangs between Ridge and Taylor like the ghost of everything they formerly were, because now there are no further secrets left to hide before, no further comforting half-trueness to soften the blow, only the raw, jagged verity that Ridge must carry alone while Taylor stands before him stripped of defenses and quality, watching the man she shattered retreat into an emotional distance. Colder than any wrathfulness she could have prepared for, and that silence terrifies her further than his rage ever could, because it signals not passion but detachment, not heartbreak soliciting for form but a man recalibrating his entire actuality without her in it, and as Ridge withdraws, refusing to engage, refusing to yell, refusing indeed to ask questions, Taylor begins to understand that the real discipline isn't battle but impertinence, the slow consummation that she may have formerly lost him in a way that cannot be undone, and this consummation ignites a waterfall of consequences that ripple far beyond their relationship, because treason doesn't stay contained, it metastasizes, infecting Gemütlichkeit, family dynamics, and long-standing alliances, forcing everyone to defy where they stand and whom they're willing to defend when moral clarity becomes inconvenient. Ridge's internal reckoning is brutal and grim, because with every hour that passes, recollections resurface unasked, moments of closeness that now feel fake, exchanges that formerly felt sincere but now sound rehearsed, solace that echo hollowly in his mind as he wonders how long Taylor had been lying not just to him but to herself, and the more he renewals the history, the clearer it becomes that this treason wasn't impulsive or accidental but sustained, nurtured, defended by deliberate choices that needed planning and emotional compartmentalization, and this consummation hits harder than the affair itself, because it means that while Ridge was fighting for their future, Taylor was still conserving another Bonnie on the side, a reality that leaves Ridge scuffling with demotion as much as heartache, questioning how he could have been so eyeless, how numerous people around him might have known, and whether his faith in love has always been his topmost weakness, rather than his strength. As the verity spreads, responses fracture the community along emotional fault lines, with some rushing to Ridge's defense, outraged on his behalf and unintentional to reason what they see as an insupportable treason, while others essay to contextualize Taylor's conduct, citing loneliness, emotional neglect, and undetermined trauma, arguments that only consolidate the peak and energy Ridge's growing resentment, because what he hears in those defenses isn't empathy but minimization, an attempt to adulterate the pain foisted on him by reframing Taylor as a victim of circumstance rather than the author of her own downfall, and this energizes his resoluteness to step down entirely, to reclaim control over a narrative in which he has long felt manipulated by other people's choices. Taylor, meanwhile, spirals into an extremity of identity as the persona she has precisely cultivated defeats under scrutiny, because she can no longer claim moral superiority, cannot place herself as the wounded party, cannot hide behind once offerings or emotional scars, and for the first time, she's forced to defy the possibility that her pattern of jest, seeking emotional retreat outside of delicate trueness, avoiding battle until deception feels easier than honesty, may be the common thread in every failed relationship she has ever had, a consummation that leaves her oscillating between crushing guilt and protective vindication, as she struggles to attune the woman she believed herself to be with the woman everyone now sees. The secret nut's presence looms larger in the fate, not as a romantic figure but as a symbol of everything that went awry, because his involvement exposes the depth of Taylor's deception and raises uncomfortable questions about emotional boundaries, responsibility, and whether this affair was ever about love at all or simply about escape, and as details crop, how long it lasted, how deeply entwined their lives came, what pledges were made, Ridge's pain evolves into commodity sharper, more bent, because each disclosure confirms that conciliation would bear not just remission but tone treason, an immolation of quality he's no longer willing to make, and this clarity, however painful, becomes the foundation of his metamorphosis. What follows isn't explosive drama but decelerate burn desolation, as Ridge begins totally disentangling his life from Taylor's, emotionally and virtually, making opinions that gesture futurity rather than concession, and each step he takes down from her forces Taylor to defy the permanence of her conduct, because she realizes too late that guilt doesn't guarantee redemption and that love, formerly eroded by sustained deceitfulness, cannot always be rebuilt, no matter how sincere the reason or how deep the remorse, and this consummation drives her to despair, to last gutter attempts at explanation and connection that only support Ridge's resoluteness to keep his distance, because he understands now that propinquity without trust is just another form of tone detriment. As Ridge reclaims his autonomy, his connections with others shift in unanticipated ways, with old confidants stepping back into his route and new alliances forming around participated values rather than participated history, and this reconfiguration of his world is both empowering and disorienting, because it forces him to defy who he's without the emotional graveness of Taylor pulling him back into familiar patterns, and for the first time in a long while, Ridge begins to imagine a unborn defined not by conciliation or form but by boundaries, tone respect, and the turn down to settle for love that demands silence or immolation of verity, a perspective that marks a profound elaboration from the man he used to be. Taylor's reckoning continues in insulation, as the support she assumed would be unconditional becomes tentative indeed, contingent on responsibility rather than defenses, and this insulation forces her inward, compelling her to examine the emotional eyeless spots that allowed her to justify a double life while believing herself unable of causing detriment, and this soul-searching is neither quick nor comforting, because it requires her to accept that pain foisted with good intentions still counts as pain, that love doesn't vindicate deceitfulness, and that being hurt in the history doesn't grant authorization to hurt others in the present, assignments that arrive too late to save her relationship with Ridge but not too late to alter her understanding of herself. The larger narrative shifts as well, because this treason becomes an exemplary tale rumored in other connections, a memorial that emotional neglect, undetermined resentment, and implied requirements can mold into commodity far more destructive if left unaddressed, and as others reflect on their own choices in the shadow of Taylor's fall from grace, the story expands beyond one couple's implosion into a broader contemplation on trust, communication, and the dangerous appeal of secretiveness, themes that reverberate deeply in a world where appearances frequently mask deeper trueness. In the end, the true impact of Taylor's double life isn't measured by the affair itself but by the unrecoverable metamorphosis it triggers, because Ridge emerges from the wreckage changed, no longer willing to conflate abidance with love or fidelity with tone erasure. The fallout refuses to settle, because in this world consequences do and arrive all at formerly, they arrive in swells, each one crueler than the last, and just when Ridge believes he has reached emotional ground. Establishment enough to stand on, another verity shells, another memory reframes itself, another quiet demotion seeps in and reminds him that treason isn't an event but a process, one that continues long after the secret is exposed, because now he must live with the knowledge that while he was fighting for clarity and honesty, Taylor was precisely managing damage control, deciding what corridor of herself to reveal and what corridor to keep retired, and that consummation venoms indeed the moments of calm he tries to claim for himself, as if peace itself feels undeserved until he completely understands how deeply the deception ran. Ridge begins to fate that the most insidious aspect of Taylor's double life wasn't the affair, but the emotional gaslighting that accompanied it, the subtle way she diverted dubitation, reframed his dubieties as instability, and deposited herself as the wounded party whenever he tasted commodity was wrong, and this mindfulness forces him into a painful reckoning with his own instincts, because the verity is he did feel it, he did smell the distance, the emotional inconsistencies, the moments when her attention drifted away, but he ignored them because believing her was easier than defying the possibility that the woman he trusted most was able of similar sustained deceitfulness, and that tone treason lingers now as a quiet pang, driving his determination to no way again silence his suspicion for the sake of emotional comfort. Taylor, meanwhile, attempts to rebuild narrative control, not through falsehoods this time but through picky vulnerability, participating fractions of guilt without completely surrendering to responsibility, and this partial honesty only deepens the fracture, because what Ridge, and others, see isn't growth but fear of being completely seen in the fate of her choices, fear of accepting that intentions cannot undo impact, and sweat that once her conduct are understood without the bumper of defense, there will be no interpretation of the story in which she emerges as anything other than the mastermind of her own destruction, and this fear drives her to oscillate between tone pity and guard, a cycle that alienates indeed those who might have supported her had she been willing to face the verity without defenses. As days turn into weeks, the social consequences consolidate, because treason has a way of forcing people to choose sides indeed when they don't want to, and every gathering becomes a minefield of implied pressure, loaded silences, and exchanges that suddenly stop when certain names are mentioned, and Ridge feels the weight of that discomfort acutely, not because he wants sympathy but because he resents being made into a symbol, an exemplary tale others brood about while pretending not to gawk, and this resentment energizes his decision to step back further, to produce physical and emotional distance not just from Taylor but from any space where his pain is treated as spectacle rather than reality. This pullout marks a turning point, because in stepping down, Ridge begins to rediscover corridors of himself that were transcended by the constant emotional labor of maintaining a shattered relationship, corridors that thrive in solitariness, reflection, and autonomy, and this detection is both liberating and unsettling, because it reveals how important of his identity had been anchored to trying to make commodity broken work, and as he sheds that part, he's forced to defy who he's when he's no longer delivering, forgiving, or explaining down someone additional's jest. A battle that eventually strengthens his resoluteness to make a unborn defined by collective respect rather than emotional abidance. Taylor's insulation deepens as well, but where Ridge's solitariness brings clarity, hers brings battle, because without distractions or apologies, she's left alone with the verity of her choices, and that verity is enduring, forcing her to admit that the affair was an evanescent lapse but a sustained emotional investment that needed active deception, compartmentalization, and an amenability to prioritize particular delectation over translucency, and this acknowledgement triggers a slow unraveling of the tone image she has cleaved to for times, the belief that she was innately unable of causing irrecoverable detriment, a belief now exposed as a comforting vision rather than a reflection of reality. The secret nut's absence becomes as significant as his presence formerly was, because now that the affair is no longer hidden, it loses its power, its appeal stripped down by daylight and consequence, revealing itself not as a great love story but as an emotional escape that thrived only in secretiveness, and this consummation leaves Taylor defying the emptiness at the center of the relationship she risked everything for, an emptiness that glasses the one she was trying to escape, forcing her to accept that the affair didn't fill a void but simply delayed the reckoning she now faces alone. Ridge's elaboration continues still, without grand affirmations or dramatic duns, as he begins setting boundaries not as discipline but as protection, refusing exchanges that circle back to defense, declining assignations that feel performative, and choosing silence over engagement when he senses manipulation, and this restraint becomes his topmost strength, because it signals not bitterness but maturity, a turn down to be pulled back into emotional chaos under the guise of check, and those around him begin to notice the shift, fading that the man who formerly wore his heart on his sleeve has learned the value of discretion, tone preservation, and purposeful distance. As the narrative expands, the ripple goods of the treason force others to defy their own vulnerabilities, egging delicate exchanges about dedication, emotional neglect, and the dangerous supposition that good intentions can compensate for poor choices, and these exchanges expose fractures in other connections, revealing how fluently undetermined resentment can transubstantiate into secretiveness when communication breaks down, and while not every relationship shatters, none remain untouched by the exemplary shadow of Taylor's fall from grace, because her story becomes a glass reflecting uncomfortable trueness others would rather ignore. Taylor's path forward becomes decreasingly uncertain, because redemption in this world isn't guaranteed by guilt alone, and she begins to realize that rebuilding trust requires further than justifications, it requires sustained responsibility, changed jest, and the modesty to accept that remission may no way come, and this consummation marks the morning of a painful but necessary metamorphosis, one that forces her to sit with discomfort rather than escape it, to defy patterns rather than explain them, and to accept that growth doesn't always lead back to what was lost, but occasionally forward into an unborn defined by hard-earned tone mindfulness rather than romantic confirmation. Ridge, on the other hand, reaches a moment of quiet resoluteness, a recognition that mending doesn't bear answers to every question or explanations for every treason, but rather the amenability to release what cannot be changed, and this release doesn't come with remission yet maybe it no way will but it comes with acceptance, a predicated understanding that adhering to wrathfulness only prolongs connection to pain, and in choosing to let go, Ridge reclaims power of his narrative. No longer defined by what was done to him but by what he chooses to do next. The final verity that emerges from the wreckage is both sobering and clarifying. Love doesn't fail because people are amiss, It fails because honesty is offered in the name of comfort, because fear replaces communication, and because emotional requirements are met in secretiveness rather than participated vulnerability. And in the fate of Taylor's exposed double life, what remains isn't just heartache but hard-earned wisdom, a memorial that closeness without verity is envision, that fidelity without translucency is a performance, and that the most ruinous backstabbings are frequently committed not out of malignancy but out of avoidance. And as both Ridge and Taylor move forward on divergent paths, carrying the weight of what was lost and what was learned, the story doesn't end with check but with consequence, because in this world, exposure is only the beginning. The real story is who you come once the verity can no longer be ignored.